Hello and welcome to the video for Vexx. This video will focus on the theory behind Vexx and how to use it and some of its options. We'll start here on the main screen where you can see we can select our units, inch or millimeter, and set a width of this gridded work table that we have. We can also set an origin. I usually leave my origin in the center because it matches with gears that I transfer from Garrotic. But in this video we won't use Garrotic at all. We'll simply focus on the tools in Vexx and how to use them. So I'm going to set myself up in millimeters. The same theories work, however, for both inches and millimeters. To start a discussion on Vexx, we have to talk about the purpose of Vexx. It is not meant to be a general drawing program, and it holds only three types of entities. It has lines, arcs, and Bezier curves, and these first three buttons up at the top here under drawing tools are those lines, arcs, and Beziers. Vexx doesn't allow for any polyline entities at all. It doesn't allow for free-form drawing. It is meant to be more of a mechanical program, and as such I didn't want to deal with polylines. There are lots of drawing programs out there that people can use, and because of the way Vexx operates, I wanted everything to operate on a mathematical basis. So lines, arcs, Bezier curves, and so on can all be represented by formulas where polyline entities can't. There are generations of lines, and as a result Vexx doesn't deal well with those types of entities. This is not to say that polyline entities can't be represented. They're represented by single line segments, which means the program can get unwieldy if you're dealing with something with millions of line segments, since each segment will actually be an individual line and not a polyline type of entity. Let's take a look at our menu system to see how to select things that might make it a bit easier to understand. First of all, the drawing tools are pretty obvious. We have lines, and if we select a line, we can just draw continuous lines. Every time we click, we'll get another line segment. Now, when you're drawing a line, or any entity really, you'll notice that there are tips on the screen. This one, for example, is telling me the number of degrees down that I'm going in a distance. Your tab key will select between those two boxes, and you're free to type a number into either one of them at any time. In this, for example, I've got minus 33.5 degrees currently where my mouse is. I can change that and type the number 45 and hit enter, and now my line will be constrained to a 45-degree angle. You can see wherever I move my mouse, the line will always be at 45 degrees because I've locked that in. If I hit tab, and I then tell it I want a particular length in this case, type 150 for example, and hit enter, that line gets completed at 45 degrees with a set distance that we typed into the tips. So whenever you see tip boxes on the screen, you're free to hit tab to select between the tip boxes and simply type a number and hit enter to lock that particular entry so that it will apply to the current entity that you're drawing. This goes as well for arcs, but the tip boxes will change. As you can see, as I'm moving my mouse, it's as if I'm drawing a line at the moment, but when I set that first line, which I could have set by typing into the tip boxes, I'm now asked for things such as radius. And I can enter a radius, 50 millimeters for example, and our arc will complete with a 50 millimeter radius. So you can always use the tip boxes to quickly type in more accurate dimensions of things that you wish to create. In Bezier curves, the rules are the same. You can type in coordinates for a distance and angle to the point that you wish to set, and a Bezier angle or a Bezier curve will be created from the entries that you make. At this point, we should talk about the right-click menu. When you right-click, you'll get a radial menu, and there's selections here where you could change between entity types. Here we have Bezier, arcs, lines, and at the top we have a check mark. A check mark means to complete the current tool, which means we can terminate a Bezier, but we're still in Bezier mode. If you look over here at the side, you'll see the Bezier is still lit up, so we can still type in more Beziers. Check mark will stop it. Now, if you happen to be in any of the primitives, such as you're drawing a box, hitting your check mark will totally terminate that tool, so that you're then free to select things on the screen, for example. Now, Bezier curves, when selected, have control handles that you can use on them to adjust your curves. And in the case of a mid-node, it has three handles. One handle will move a tangent on one side, the top handle will control the tangent on the other side, and the middle handle by pushing in and out and bending will control both tangents to keep things into a more continuous curvature. In case you're editing something and you want to maintain a curvature across various control points. Now also in the right-click menu is a undo and redo. If we hit undo, we can simply undo changes that we made to curves or undo the placement of entities entirely if we keep on undoing. There's a limited number of undos. I think it goes back 15 or 20. But generally you can undo or redo at will. Also on the right-click menu you will find a pair of scissors. This is for trimming entities, and it's an intersection engine. It's still being tweaked by me, but it works well most of the time. You can see when you hover over any part of any line, a section of it will turn red. That will be the section which will be trimmed off if you hit your button. There are ways to modify this, however, and if we look on the screen up in the upper right-hand corner, you can see that at all times you will see a icon, for example, of scissors because we're in scissor mode. The square with the 4 node points on it means that we're in node editing mode. In node editing mode, when you select an entity, the nodes show up for editing. And node entity mode is normally on and can be turned off in this menu, in the Radial menu. Down below we have node editing, which we can turn off. And if you turn it off, you won't get access to the nodes. There's very little reason to turn that off other than it may stop some annoying nodes from appearing on the screen when you're playing with various entities. I normally leave it on, however. Now at the same time on the screen, I'm going to go back to the scissors here. You can see that a control key and 2 shift keys have appeared below. And this is to indicate to you that these are modifiers that can be used. If, for example, I hover my scissors over this end of a Bezier curve, you can see that it intersects with the square and it knows it would trim it right at the beginning of the square. That may not be what you might want, however. So you are free to push the left shift button, in which case it will only trim from the mouse to that particular entity. Or you can push the right-hand shift key, in which case it will only cut from the mouse forward through to the other end of an entity. And this allows you to select and clip an entity to be smaller on either side than what it is without clipping out the entire entity. Now the control key is also used as a modifier. Here, for example, if I hover my mouse on this box, you can see that we're selecting from the beginning of this Bezier curve to the beginning of the intersection of this Bezier curve. And if I click, we'll remove that entire area. Now if I back up, the control key tells it to select single entity only, which means that if I hover over, because this square is built of 4 entities, 4 lines, by hitting control I can say I only want to snip 1 entity. So between the 2 shift keys and the control key, you'll find that clipping your diagram is actually fairly easy. Now something to be noted is that Vexx is a contour engine as well. It wants to see all entities connected. When I trimmed these parts of the square out, if I click on this Bezier, you can see that the line at the end is now a part of that Bezier. It all becomes one contour. Similarly over here, when I select, you can see we have a start point which is green on this particular contour, and it runs through the entire contour to the end to this red point. It automatically joins things together as you trim and as you cut them. When it fails to do that, you can always pick up, because we're in node editing mode, you could pick up a node and move it. Now here, while I'm moving entities, you notice we have a control key lit up in the top right hand corner of the screen, and that means that that's a modifier for this type of editing procedure. If we're going to edit a node, we can push the control key and move a node, and when we do, we will break that contour. We now have 2 contours, one comprising the Bezier and the other comprising what remains of that square. If I go to the node editing and I pick up a node and just bring it close to that node, however, I've just created a new contour which comprises all of them again. So keep note of which control key modifiers are lit up in the corner, and you'll find that you should be able to trim things fairly nicely to make them do whatever you want. In terms of the power of clipping, I'm just going to run a bunch of lines on the screen, and let's add a few Bezier curves. And finally, let's add a mess of an arc. Now the scissors are actually fairly intelligent, and you'll find that they can snip out sections quite quickly, but there are times it will mess up where it doesn't see an intersection between 2 points. When that happens, you're going to want to use your control keys and your shift key in order to trim out a smaller section. And once you trim out that smaller section, you may find that things begin to act more as you'd expect them to do. Its chances of getting confused are directly proportional to exactly how many intersections it has to look for and the complexity of those intersections. Finding the intersection between Beziers and other entities can be difficult, so reducing the complexity of what you're looking at can really help. So those are the basic primitive operations. We also have a reference point button. And with reference points, you can simply drop points on the screen. They will not become part of your drawing. They are not saved in a DXF context. But by placing them carefully, because you can type an X and Y coordinate as you're placing them into the tip boxes, you can place them exactly where you want them to be. And this can aid in drawing, because when you're drawing, you will snap to those points quite easily simply by moving your mouse close. And closeness is something that we should discuss. The program uses the graphics system to determine exactly what you're trying to do. It's a bit heuristic, but it means that when you zoom in, you stand a better chance of finding the exact points that you want because it uses the number of pixels you are away from something on the screen to determine as to whether or not it should snap to that point. If you draw circles or arcs, automatic snap points are added into the system. So now I've drawn this arc. When I get close to an endpoint, you can see it changes to an X, and that's to tell you you will be drawing from that endpoint. If you don't want to draw from that endpoint, you should zoom in, and then you can select a spot which is a little bit further away in order to start an object. You can see here we could start very closely to this point, where if we were zoomed out and I tried to click on this point, I would actually snap to the other points. So zooming in and zooming out is a very valid way of being a lot more accurate in how you want to place something, because Vexx is going to try to help you every step of the way to make sure that it's going to the points that you wish and that it's creating the contours that you actually want to create. Another way to cancel a tool, incidentally, is pushing the escape button. Because if you're in a line drawing situation and you hit the OK button up here, the finish, you're still in a line drawing mode, as can be seen over here. Pressing the escape key will remove you from any drawing type. Now, when you don't have a tool selected, you can see there's a control key lit up on the screen here, still under our modifiers. This means that if you hit control, the system's going to act a little differently. And we can see that if I push the control key and move close to a line, the cursor turns into a target. This means that you can connect to lines without actually knowing exactly where you're going to connect, but you want to tell the system, I really do want to connect to that line. So if, for example, I go to the line drawing program, hit the control key, if I hover my control key over a line, I can then use that position to connect other drawing entities to, and that line will actually be part of and connected to the original contour line. It won't form its own contour. If I select it, you can see it's a contour that begins at the line, but this can make it easier when you're trimming something, because then it knows where that line connected because you actually drew the line connected to it. Another function of that hover, I'm going to turn off scissors. When I push control and I hover and I have a small target being shown, I can right click and I'll get a new menu. Add node is one member of that menu. And if I hit add node, a node appears where I was so that I can modify that line further. This works on arcs, Beziers, and lines. Then we go to our primitives. Our primitives are simply circles drawn in two different ways, allowing you to do placement of circles in ways that are proportional to other pieces of geometry. We also have a square. All of these things, once you play it, just become individual contours, and they act exactly as contours should act. So they're all quite trimmable to be whatever you wish them to be. Trimming is one of the best features of Vexx. It allows you to draw very quickly and to make things that you might have found difficult to make in other ways. In addition to the primitives, we have a vining system that I threw in because we had a vine under the old system. And I wanted to, for the sake of completion, have another type of vine. This is called a Harris curve, actually. It's a relation to the golden ratio. It's actually derived from the silver ratio, which is a much lesser known mathematical constant. But I thought it looked good as a decoration or a flourish for drawings, so I threw it in. We also have a spiral tool where we can specify a spiral. Now I give you the golden ratio as a button that you can instantly set to a spiral, but a spiral can actually be any type of, any ratio. Here, for example, if I put a ratio of 2, my spiral simply gets larger. And this is simply how much does the radius grow through each revolution of the spiral. As a result, you can make as many as you want. The slotting tool we went into in our original video, and we should talk about that for a second so that you have a clear understanding of how the selection system works within Vexx. Here I've drawn a circle on the screen, and we want to add slots to it. We're not at a 0, 0 location, which is my origin is in the center, and we still want to slot into there. In order to set the center accurately, if you click any object in Vexx once, it will turn red to show you that it is selected. If you click it a second time, we'll go to what I call the blue mask selection. This tells you that you're ready to move your circle. You can rotate it with this dot on the side, and it will tell you how many degrees you're actually rotating it. This is a circle. Rotating it doesn't make any sense, of course. You can also scale things and move them around, but there's a little gray dot that will always be in your selector. And this is a way of setting center for almost everything in Vexx. If you select it to this blue mask centering, blue mask selection routine, you can then select that center and move it where you like. And you can see it turned green when I moved it. If I click it again, it will turn gray, telling you that it's turned off. Now, if it's turned off and you were to rotate an object, let's take this into a square so it's more obvious what we're doing. Let's just stick a square on the screen. Okay. So I'm going to select the square once, and here we're in selection mode where we can edit and move things. Clicking it a second time will put us into blue mask mode. And in blue mask mode, if I went to rotate it, you can see it rotates on the center of mass of the object. But this little dot in the center can be moved and turned on, and from that point forward, it will rotate on that center of the object. So when you set this center, many of the routines in Vexx on the tool side will know that you've selected the center. In this case, let's select the slot wizard. When I bring it up, you can see it has a center of rotation of 1681, which just happens to be where the blue dot is. So when you set this blue rotation dot or this green rotation dot, you're setting the center for both the slot wizard, the text wizard, and so on. From there, you need only enter the number of slots, which is obvious. The sweep percentage is how much of the maximum sweep available to a 6-slot system should we use. In this case, I've said 50%. We'll have a slot width of 6 millimeters or a 1/4 inch and a radius of 25 millimeters. And as you can see, that's what we got. I didn't try to fit them within the box. I just gave it a set radius. Now, each of the slots is using 50% of the radius, 50% of the sweep area that it could have used in order to create that slot. So we've taken a look at most of the primitives. We also have a ruler here, which we can stretch out to check distances between items. And then we have some offset mirroring and other routines that we should talk about. Let's put a spiral on the screen for the heck of it. We'll go back to a golden ratio. It's nice and small. Offsetting something is fairly easily done. We simply select the object and press for an offset. Now, offset has quite a few options. I'll let you play with the open and closed cornering options. Basically, the third column here, open vectors, tells the system how you want to deal with something which is not a closed contour. A spiral, for example, is not a closed contour. It has a beginning and an end, which are not joined. If you tell it to close it will close it and offset it. And as you can see, it drew a virtual line between the start and end and then offset the entire thing. That's not necessarily something that you would want in every situation, but there are situations where it comes in handy. You also want to look for small artifacts which appear because the offset tries to offset the best it can in all areas, and it found an area here that it could fit, and it's just a small one, and that may not be something you want. So always look for little areas that might have shown up. If I undo and we select offset again, we could say we want a round end instead on an open vector, and then you'll see we no longer close the vector and we simply get that entire object offset. And now here's where we need to talk about line segments and polylines again. Because as you can see by looking at this offset, I'm going to delete the current vector that we did it from. And if you look at this drawing, you'll see there are several colors to it. And in Vexx, lines are drawn in blue, arcs are drawn in green and Bezier curves are drawn in orange. The system, when it offsets, is normally done in a point cloud mode. So I offset something in point clouds, but we don't want to deal with polylines and point clouds. So the system automatically converts things into lines, arcs, and Beziers. And if I select one of these, as I zoom in, you'll see the control handles show up for the Beziers. Sure sign that you're in a Bezier curve. While other lines simply move around. In here you can see it's trying to maintain that original arc. So in this case, just move that back in. In this case, we have several different types of entities, but it's all automatic what you're going to get. Now there are times that you may not want that. Let me back up to the point that we were offsetting this unit, and I'll delete the offset. Now there are options up here in our options setting where we can ask it to not offset to curves. In this case, we could say just allow lines. And if I then did an offset of 3 millimeters, you can see the result is all blue. But it's made up only of lines, and they can be a little harder to edit and a little harder to deal with than most other entity types. But they're also the most accurate types. So you'll find an offset of this is almost always dead on, where if instead we use arcs, the shape can change a little bit. Now there are buttons over here on your editing tools for converting to arcs, Beziers, and lines, or converting back to line segments. If I convert what we have on the screen now to arcs, Beziers, and lines, you can see it converts fairly well. The shape is primarily preserved, but there are always mathematical ambiguities that can cause these arcs, lines, and polylines, or arcs, lines, and Beziers to not conform to the exact shape that you want it. So it's something to keep in mind. You can turn that off, or you can shift things back into lines with the line switcher, but it can make it harder for you to edit. Another thing we have is mirroring. We can, of course, select any area and then mirror it. The mirroring can also make a copy and flip it over. It is your choice as to whether you're going to make a copy. If you select Make Copy, it will flip it and move it as well in order to give you that copy. If you don't select Make Copy, it will simply flip it where it is. Again, all your choice. Just a note on offsetting, you can offset things even which are quite complex. It will do the best job it can. It won't always do what you expect, perhaps, and it can take a while. Here I've commanded a 3 millimeter offset of this particular vine. This vine, incidentally, is called a Harris curve, after a high school teacher, Mr. Harris, who discovered it just in the last year or two. Prior to that, it was unknown that the silver ratio could actually give you a nice looking vine shape. So as you can see, the offset did fairly well. The result is comprised primarily of arcs by the look of it. I don't see any orange, so it doesn't look like any Bezier curves were adopted in the offset. But it's offsetting both to the insides and the outside, and can create a nice looking graphic depending on how it's done. I just mentioned that so that you know that you don't have to offset small sections at a time or anything. In addition to that, we have scaling, we have grid array and circular arrays. The thing to remember about circular arrays and so on is that when it's asking for a center, you can create those centers again by moving your center dot. It will save you from typing things in because when you go to do a grid array, the center will already be filled in for you. When you're doing a circular array, you can select your number of copies, a radius of how far out you wish to be. You can increment how much something is rotated on each of the circular rotations, etc. I advise you to play with this. You'll find that it can be used for making clock faces and so on, which I'll likely show in a future video. It can also take a while to operate. Here you can see I've rotated this Harris curve several times and again created a god-awful mess of lines and entities. And when the program starts to see something this complex, you might expect some slowdown. Let's weld this and just see what happens out of curiosity. And the welding could take a bit of time. That is an awful lot of arrays to deal with. And there we have our welding. So using welding with complex data sets can sometimes give you shapes that you might find advantageous in your use of kinetic vanes and gears and so on. All right, I'm not going to torture everyone with a whole lot of examples here. I just wanted this to be a quick introduction into how to deal with Vexx. I urge you to play with it in terms of what you can do. You'll find that the trimming is very powerful, and also you can select different types of tips, different types of snaps, and so on. Most of these you're going to find are self-explanatory as you play with them. Let me know what you find, and I hope you have fun. Thanks a lot.